everyone! First off, I would like to thank everyone for taking the time to watch this video. Today I'm going to be giving a mini lecture on Aristotle. I would like to begin by saying that I hope everyone gets some good life application from this video, and I hope to hear if learning about Aristotle and his life impacted you in some way, shape, or form in the comments below. With that said, let's get started. I will be taking you through a step-by-step of Aristotle's life, including Aristotle's background, some of his characteristics, and events, accomplishments, and many of the things written in his legacy by many historians. Aristotle's birth and background. Aristotle was born in Stargia, a city in the Chaldaic Peninsula in the Kingdom of Macedon, in what was estimated to be 385 to 84 BC. Stargus was a seaport on the coast of Thrace. In the age of Pericles, Euboea was under Athenian control, yet subsequently it was detached near the end of the Archimedean War by Basileus. Later, the peninsula was incorporated while Aristotle was a baby into the Macedonian kingdom. Aristotle was under King Philip's rule and then under Alexander the Great's rule during his lifetime. Many Greeks still regarded Macedonians as foreign invaders. So, although Aristotle spent much time in Athens, he was not an Athenian citizen, and he might not have even been known as Greek to those around him. Furthermore, because there were many vital relations between the Greek cities, Aristotle was affected by those relations between Athens and Macedon, as we will see later in this video. Early childhood. Upon birth, Aristotle belonged to a guild called Asclepiades. By his belonging to this guild, Aristotle automatically followed the trade of his father Nicomachus. Nicomachus was a court physician to Amyntas III, and by guild a physician was what Aristotle was predestined to become. Now Aristotle was not poor, by no means. His mother, Phaestus, came from a wealthy family that owned an estate near the town of Chalcis on Euboea. Because of his family lineage, Aristotle began to pursue an interest in the biological sciences. Yet, when he had barely begun, both of his parents died when he was about 10 years old. Then he was taken in by a guardian. Proxenus took the child as his own, treating him like a son, and made sure he had the best education possible. Before I discuss the events of Aristotle's life, let me make some comments on his character traits. Aristotle had many character traits. His physical traits are assumed to have included baldness, skinny legs, and small eyes, among other things, and yet God made him handsome according to others. Although he was supposedly small in stature and spoke with a lisp, he made up for it with his fashion. Aristotle was supposedly to have worn lots of jewelry and cared about his appearance more than most. Unfortunately, he was known to be a little bit of a smart aleck. I mean, what would you expect a really smart, timid, indecisive, skinny teenage boy to do with his wits? While some claim he turned into an escapist of sorts, this makes sense with the type of lifestyle he wanted to live. For an application in our time, think of that one science professor who would rather be spending their time noting all the intricate details of marine life at the beach instead of chillaxing. This is the type of escaping Aristotle did. Some of Aristotle's positive character traits include his considerate and mindful nature. We see this in his careful observations about life, but we also see it in the outlining of his will. In it, he specifically requests his beloved wife's first wife's body to be placed in the same tomb as his, and he provides provisions for his second wife and his children. He even provides care for his slaves. We can see that Aristotle was a cheeky young fellow, but he did grow up into what seems to be like a smart and caring man. Speaking of growing up, let's transition over to some memorable events, accomplishments, and the legacy that Aristotle left in his life. Next up, we have Aristotle's education. Told you we would get there. To start off, after some time had passed from his own parents' passing, Aristotle entered what historians call the Platonic Academy. When he was around 17 years old, he was originally sent there to learn how to practice medicine, but soon took an interest in other things like biology, history, and philosophy. The academy was home to Aristotle's master Plato. From then on, Aristotle would learn everything from Plato. From there, he would fashion his own view of the world. As time went on, the two began to differ. Once Aristotle knew Plato's philosophy, some differences began to occur between Plato's abstract and utopian philosophy and Aristotle's empirical, practical, and commonsensical approach. In this video, I will only discuss 3 differences between them: the theory of forms, politics, and ethics. First off, we have the theory of forms versus the theory of the prime mover. The theory of forms is known to be Plato's theory of reality, in essence, the reason, logos, of all life. And in a similar way, Aristotle's theory of the prime mover serves the same function. Essentially, Aristotle differs from Plato in that Plato feels there is a perfect reality that can be attained in our lifetime, and the things that are not perfect are just phenomena, in the third quote, or particulars, imitating a higher concept that is a more perfect ideal because it is closer to perfection, which Plato refers to as the good. The good transcends and is above and beyond everything. It illuminates the rational part of the soul. It is eternal and exists forever. He claims the more that people incline their reason toward the realm of the forms, the more clearly they apprehend truth. Sounds like a certain Jesus guy that us Christians are always trying to understand on a deeper level. Just saying. Whereas Aristotle viewed reality as a series of causes, and each cause as an end goal or purpose. Aristotle actually grew to reject Plato's theory of forms, but not the idea of form itself. He mentioned that things took their own form, and that was what they were. He understood reality empirically, that means with data, and through knowledge that is gained by a sense of physical or material world. Aristotle believed that one could come to knowledge or truth through our own perceptions and the perceptions of others. He argued that everything had an ending, means, or purpose, which he called telos. Lastly, stemming from his causation theory, probably the greatest part of Aristotle's theory is the prime mover itself. Since everything had to have a cause and an end goal, Aristotle argued for a prime or first mover that set all the causes in motion. The prime mover was just like Plato's form of the good, in the fact that they are both transcendent, both the cause of all, both unchangeable and perfect, they could not be corrupt, they both were immaterial, and they both existed eternally. The difference in Aristotle's theory was that there had to be a reason the prime mover was there, a telos, if I may, and he concluded that it produces things by being loved, and it draws things to itself through its perfection, yet it is impersonal and does not act in the world. Oh, this is so crazy to me. Aristotle is so close to realizing God. He just has a couple flaws in his ideas. Moving on, let's look at their theory of politics, and specifically Aristotle's politics. It can be noted that Aristotle believed that politics were a practical science, that all other sciences could fall under. He deemed it as the most authoritative science, and it had many educated appeals to the realm of political science. For Plato, political science was a form of the good that could only be mastered by philosophers who were completely virtuous, and it was a part of the good in general, but for Aristotle, politics was a rational activity of the soul guided by virtues, including moral excellence. Aristotle is notorious for his observation that man is a political animal. This meant that human beings naturally formed basic political communities, and it was impossible for them to thrive otherwise. Besides that observation, Aristotle is also known for introducing a classification system of forms of government. By this classification, states may be classified according to their number of their rulers and the interests in which they govern. As you can see here, there are 5 forms of classification. The monarchy, represented by the now deceased and coveted Queen of England, the aristocracy on the top right, oligarchy, aristocracy's greedy aunt, or should we say ants, and the last one, you guessed it, tyranny, which I represented with a picture of Hitler because it is the worst of all in Aristotle's highly educated opinion. Aristotle argues that the best form of government is monarchy, in which one person rules in the interest of all people, the second highest form of government being aristocracy, which is a minority ruling in the interest of all the people in the state. Thirdly, if the first two are not available, Aristotle decided on polity, or the majority ruling in the interest of all people, unlike democracy, which rules in the interest of itself, leading to a mob mentality. Lastly, there are 2 elements of Aristotle's teaching that affected European political institutions for many centuries, and those are the elements of slavery and usury. Aristotle was pro-slavery when it came to his political stances, and the way he saw it was that slaves were a nature in themselves. Unlike some of the dissenters who thought slavery to be unjust and in contrast to nature, Aristotle deemed it as a life form. He claimed that the brutish and inferior would be better off being controlled by a master than give their own free will. The second element we need to cover is his view of usury. Usury is the lending out of money for a high return from interest. and Aristotle did not view this act highly. He claimed that money and possessions had two uses, the improper and the proper use. Usury, he claimed, was an unnatural way of earning money, therefore usury was an improper way of commerce. This implied that was far away from its initial telos, and therefore further away from virtue, which we will discuss in the next section. The last way Aristotle differed from Plato was in his theory of ethics. To introduce ethics, I will start by saying that both Plato and Aristotle agreed the central problem was achievement of happiness, the idea of perfect human flourishing. But where they differed stems from their views of reality. Plato viewed ethics much like he did with politics and concluded that it was an ideal form, the difference being that ethics was the good in itself. Aristotle differed in viewing the search for happiness as a rational search of the soul guided by virtues. These virtues only gain traction and could lead one closer to the truth if they practiced them. This is what Aristotle called habituation, the practice of habits. One legacy that Aristotle left were his many works. Most of them are supplemented by historians through accounts written of Aristotle's lectures. In this video, we are going to discuss some of the topics out of one of the three primary works on ethics. These three works are the Magna Moralia, or Great Ethics, the Ethnica Eudemia, or Eudemia Ethics, and the Ethica Nicomacheia, or Nicomachean Ethics. The third of which is what we will be talking about. This concept of virtue was at the core of Nicomachean ethics, and within the concept of virtue there are three subcategories that Aristotle claims make up happiness. Wisdom is happiness, friendship and political community, and humanity's ethical responsibilities. We're going to discuss each one. Wisdom was one of the three ways one could achieve virtue and thereby happiness. This idea of wisdom is happiness stemmed from the idea that the wise person will be happy because they are knowledgeable of what the virtuous actions are and able to live by them. There are two types of wisdom: phronesis, which is practical wisdom of life, and sophia, which is the intellectual wisdom a person acquires. The culmination of both phronesis and sophia was complete wisdom, the ability to understand, appreciate, and contemplate knowledge. The second pillar of the concept of virtue is friendship and political community. Aristotle builds on his theory that political science is in itself ethics because he claims the idea that friendship should apply principles of justice, and since humans are political in nature, they would automatically lean towards the justice and absolute virtue that political science calls for. The three types of friendship are the friendship of unity, pleasure, and goodness. Strategic friendship was not necessarily a real friendship. It was just an acquaintance you kept on the side for their resources. Pleasure was based on friendship that was mutual in nature, and for the most part, the people were there for what they both could get out of each other. Lastly, the friendship of goodness was the best friendship you could have. It's that friend that would, no matter what, would ultimately be there for you, and you just point each other towards justice and towards deeper virtue and happiness. Out of all three of these pillars of virtues, the concept that humans have ethical responsibilities allows a person to give as much credit to themselves as possible in a virtuous way. Aristotle argues that they will become more knowledgeable and grow closer to knowing the truth. Hence, they would be able to give themselves an honest assessment of their own worth. He believed that people who understood their worth should owe themselves the best life possible. To me, this makes sense because a person who is wise will know how to give themselves the best life possible because of their wisdom. But would they have the work ethic? Well, that was a brief overview of Aristotle and Plato's views on forms, politics, and ethics, and some of their key differences. These are some key legacies that Aristotle left, and they are still being discussed to this day. The last part of this video is about the later part of Aristotle's life, his family, tutoring Alexander, founding the academy, and some events leading up to his death. Aristotle had remained part of the academy under Plato until Plato's death in 347 BC. It is speculated that he left after the successor of the academy was named, and it was not him. At the announcement of Speusippus as the next head, Aristotle left Assos with one of his dear friends and disciples, Hermias, to continue his studies abroad. While he was away, Aristotle took a liking to Hermias' niece, Pythias, and they got married. They had a daughter whom they also named Pythias. As historians say, his marriage was happy. His first wife ended up dying, and Aristotle took up a second wife. With Hercules, they had a son named Nicomachus, whom it is speculated Aristotle's works were named after. Somewhere during this time, Aristotle traveled back to Macedon and began to tutor Alexander the Great. After his friend and monarch of the city, Hermias, was killed by the Persians, Aristotle honored his memory and ended up traveling further to Lesbos and then back to Macedon. Once back in Macedon, Aristotle was called to tutor the young prince via his connections to the Macedonian court. Unfortunately, though, Alexander had to permanently drop his coursework at the murder of his father. After this, Aristotle returned to Athens and founded his own rival school to the Academy. Aristotle ended up hosting his academy at the Lyceum or Gymnasium attached to the Temple of Apollo, and this is where Aristotle's school got its name, the Lyceum. Unlike Plato's school, which is focused on mathematics, Aristotle's school was centered on biology and history. Unfortunately, he didn't get to live out this whole life as headmaster. In 323 BC, Alexander died, which resulted in an outbreak of anti-Macedonian feelings in Athens, and Aristotle received the brunt of the accusations for his relative Callisthenes, who was a historiographer who provoked disfavor by his censure of the king's attempts to invest in semi-constitutional positions towards his Hellenistic subjects. It is not known if he died by the hands of the Athenians or if he rotted in prison, but certainly it led to Aristotle being a victim of civil strife. They indicted him on the charge of impiety, or lack of reverence for the gods, yet it is said his real offense was his connection with the Macedonian court. Aristotle then made the smart move and withdrew with that escapist personality to Chalcis once again with his disciples. And to conclude with this lecture, Aristotle died at the ripe old age of 62 or 63. Not only did he have an eventful life, but he left so many ideas and concepts in the minds of his pupils, of which have influenced us tremendously. That is all for my video on Aristotle, everyone. Hope you enjoyed learning about his background, character, and his life events and accomplishments. Feel free to look at the next slide for some critical thinking questions. Thanks for watching.